Who's ready for some politics? I know I am. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about red, blue, and purple states. After all, election time is just around the corner, and there's a lot made about these red and blue and purple states, what exactly they are, and how they vote, typically in the context of presidential elections. But how exactly do you tell when a state is red or blue, purple? Well, that's what we're going to dive in today. So let's begin. Uh, best to start off with how blue and red even originated. It's been around for at least you could say about 140 years or give or take. Although not at all like what we think of it as today. It wasn't always red and blue. Every once in a while, sometimes other colors would be used. But when it was red and blue, it actually used to be more so that blue was used for Republicans or for states or counties that voted Republican, and red was Democratic. Reason being that blue was the color of the Union in the Civil War, and conservative parties in Europe and other countries and countries elsewhere, uh, they were also blue. So for some time, blue was considered the color of the Republican Party. Republicans being generally more conservative, Democrats generally being more liberal. But even as far back as 1883, from a book called Scribner's Statistical Atlas of the United States, used blue for counties that had voted Republican and red for counties that had voted Democrat. First use on TV seems to be the 1970s when color TV became a lot more commonplace, was a lot more common than black and white TVs. A couple of sources I was researching seem to have a little bit of conflicting information as to which year exactly was the first, but NPR seems to note that NBC in 1976 used blue for Gerald Ford, the incumbent then, who went into office after Richard Nixon resigned following the Watergate scandal, and then his vice president, Spiro Agnew, before he had a chance to become president, he also resigned for offenses, including, I believe, tax evasion. So Gerald Ford became president. And then red was used for Jimmy Carter, who would defeat Gerald Ford in the election. And then electoralvotemap.com says CBS News in 1972 used blue for Nixon and red for George McGovern, who was his general election opponent. But there wasn't necessarily uniformity in which party had which color across outlets. There was actually a time I was reading, I forget where exactly, but that even Republican had been yellow. Uh, but it became more consistent for the parties at about 2000 election or so. Tim Russert, former, the late correspondent, he passed away back in, I think it was '08, '09. But he was noted, even though he was not the first one to use it, and he would not say he was the first one to use it, the red blue state dichotomy is sometimes associated with him. So around 2000 is when it became more consistent, and now we today know it as red is Republican, blue is Democrat. So, what exactly makes a state red or blue or purple? Red meaning, again, Republican lean, blue meaning a Democratic lean. And when we have purple, it's a mix of blue and red. So we say that a state is a little bit more back and forth between the parties if they are purple. But calling a state red or blue or purple is not always very explanatory. Yes, it's not saying that this is how the entire state votes on everything, but when you teach people that a state is red or blue or purple, they kind of get that impression that is across the board because a lot of people aren't necessarily diving into this stuff themselves. So it is something that's a little could be a little less vague, but it doesn't account for differences in offices within a state having a different voting tendency. A state might tend to vote one way for republic or one way for presidents versus a different way for governor, or they might vote a different way for US Senate or districted offices like state legislatures or the US House might have a majority of a different party depending on how the districts are divided. And it doesn't necessarily need to be gerrymandering. It doesn't even if it's not gerrymandered, sometimes it could be different colors. But does the media get the color of these states correct? Generally, yeah, they're not necessarily wrong. But again, it's not always very in depth. And just because a state is considered red or blue does not mean that that applies to every geographical area of the state. So we got to be careful not to assume if we see a city or a county in the state, we can't necessarily say, oh, so they must vote Republican because the state typically is Republican, or they're typically Democrat because the state typically leans Democrat. Not necessarily. So, a couple of examples in Alabama, even as Alabama has become increasingly Democrat, the lone Democrat in the U.S. House is Terry Sewell. She's been there since she won in the 2010 election. Similarly, South Carolina, Jim Clyburn has been a Democratic member of the House for South Carolina since 1992, even as the state has become increasingly Republican. And now he's the only House Democrat for South Carolina. And then in Maryland, we have Republican Andy Harris, who is the only Republican in Congress. He's been the only Republican in Congress for Maryland since 2012, but he's been in office since 2010. He had another Republican from the state alongside him in that chamber. So, when can you say a state is definitively red or blue or purple? Uh, how long do you have to wait to declare such a thing? There's no real clear criteria for it. There's no, okay, if they vote Republican 3 times straight in this office, or they vote Democrat 3 times straight in this office, or 4 times, whatever. It doesn't necessarily work like that. But there are some states where you can generally say, okay, yeah, that's a red state or that's a blue state. But in any case, you should wait at least a few elections before you declare a trend. And a perfect example of that is I'll use my state, Florida. It's been declared a red state for president now, but is it? I mean, in 2020, Donald Trump won by 3 points, 3 percentage points against Joe Biden. Now, ultimately, he lost the election, and that snapped the streak of Florida voting for the winning presidential candidate since 1996. They were the only state from 1996 to 2016 to pick the winning presidential candidate, and then that got snapped in 2020 in 2020. But we probably need several presidential elections to definitively say whether it's red. Now, the state level, Florida has definitely been a red state, but for president, we need to get at least another election or two before we can definitively say that. Yes, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida in 2022, he won in a landslide against Democrat Charlie Crist, who himself was actually a Republican governor of Florida back in the late 2000s. Uh, but that doesn't automatically mean Trump will do it again in 2024, even if he has a lot of ardent supporters in the state, does not necessarily mean that it's going to happen for him in 2024. So there's not really an objective way to say, okay, or not a totally objective way to say, this is a red state, this is a blue state. But there are some states that are pretty safe to say that they are clearly red or blue on most accounts. So definitively red states, you can say Alabama, Idaho, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, Wyoming. Those are pretty red. It's not like they don't ever vote for Democrats, but it's very uncommon, and they're usually for the districted offices like state legislatures and the U.S. House. But some exceptions. Kansas is a pretty red state, but twice now they've voted for Democrat Laura Kelly for governor, even though the state legislature is very Republican. The state votes Republican a lot for U.S. Senate. In fact, it hasn't voted a Democrat for U.S. Senate since, I believe it's 1932. Uh, but otherwise, it's a pretty Republican state. And then for definitively blue states, that's those are ones like California, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island. So, especially Hawaii. Hawaii is, in fact, the number of Republicans in the state legislature there you can count on one hand. There's very few of those, and there's only been two. There's only been one person who was one Republican who has won U.S. House in Hawaii since Hawaii's been a state since 1959, and that was Patricia Sakai. I think that's how you say her name, Sakai, and she won two times back in the 80s. Uh, but other than that, you are very hard pressed to find a Republican in Hawaii. Some exceptions, Maryland, so again, pretty blue state, but they recently had a Republican governor in Larry Hogan. Now he couldn't run again in 2022, and it's Democrat again. I believe it's Wes Moore is the current governor of Maryland, but otherwise Democrats dominate the state. Now, how do you tell if a state is purple? So several ways that you can generally say something is or a state is purple is there's back and forth competitions for offices like president and governor, even if not every election is competitive. So Florida for a while was pretty, well, you could still arguably say is a pretty purple state, at least for president. But in the case of Wisconsin, there's been the last two elections have been won by Democrat Tony Evers. The two before that were Republican Scott Walker, I think, and then there was two by a Democrat before then, uh, and I believe they also did that for president as well. Another way you can say is one color for one office and another color for a different office, which you generally see less of these days. We call that ticket splitting, where in a given year somebody votes Republican for one party and they vote Democrat for another party. Now you see a lot more straight ticket voting, which is just they just vote Republican across the board or Democrat across the board. Uh, but one notable example here is in Vermont. Phil Scott has won the last four elections as a Republican, and it's otherwise a pretty Democratic, pretty left leaning state. You would say it's a blue state uh, in most respects. So, would you say it's a lighter shade of blue or whether it's purple? I mean, that's where it gets to be a little bit murkier. But the Republicans have also won governor in that state from 2002 to 2008, and Vermont and New Hampshire are the two states that have 2-year terms for their governor. And then another big way you can tell if a state is purple, or you can argue a state is purple, is if there's generally a split in partisan competition across offices. Michigan is a good example of this. Been back and forth for governor last two times. Gretchen Whitmer. The two times before that, his name escapes me, but it was a Republican, and then two times before that was a Democrat. Uh, it votes regularly Democrat for U.S. Senate, but the margins of victory have gotten smaller over time. And then there's an almost even split between the parties for state legislature and the U.S. House. In fact, the state House just flipped back in 2022, I believe, from Republican to Democrat. And then their Senate is up. All of their Senate seats are up every 4 years, and I believe it's a small Republican majority in there right now. So purple states, it gets a little bit, is it a purple state or is it a lighter shade of blue or a lighter shade of red? You know, you could argue one way or the other, but some states where you can argue are they're a lighter shade of red or blue. It's either Republicans or Democrats have won an office consistently, but there have been several close contests in recent memory. Democrats or Republicans consistently win most offices, but with some exceptions, or they often, or one party will win statewide elections much more often, but districted elections are much closer. One example of a blue state that you can say is maybe a lighter shade of blue, but you probably wouldn't say is purple, is Oregon. It's regularly Democrat for president, U.S. Senate, U.S. House. governor, but the divided in the state legislature is somewhat close. And I believe their last governor election was pretty close too. So it's still a pretty blue state, but you can argue it's a little bit of a lighter shade than, say, California or New York. Uh, red states that are a little bit less red. You could argue Ohio is predominantly Republican, but U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown for the Democrats, he's won election for his seat since 2006, and he's up for re-election this year. So we'll see if he's able to keep up the streak. And then it's been back and forth between the parties for president. That's two times. It was for no, it flipped from Donald Trump back to Donald Trump won it in 2016, and then Joe Biden won it in 2020. And before Donald Trump had won in 2016, it was Democrat in 2012. And of course, states have some of these states have changed their color over time. You look at 50, 100 years ago, some states look completely unrecognizable in terms of partisanship. The big example being the South used to be a Democratic wall. It was, if you were a Republican, you couldn't win. You almost couldn't win anything for a very long time. Not even state legislature, you would be hard pressed to get at least one or two seats. And there were some states that went decades where they were completely dominated by the Democratic Party, and Republicans didn't even win a single seat in the state legislature, and they certainly didn't win for offices like governor or U.S. Senate. Florida, again, is a great example of that. Only for a long time, it was as blue as they came, but since the 1990s, the mid 1990s, state legislature has been majority Republican. Republicans have won the governorship since 1998, each election since 1998, and they've won most of the other state executive offices since then too. State executive offices being things like attorney general or, well, secretary of state is not a it's not an elected office in Florida anymore. They changed that back in, I believe, 2002. There was a 2002 amendment, or maybe it was 1998. But Secretary of State used to be an elected office, but it's not anymore. We have a chief financial officer, which has some similarities to treasurers and auditors in other states, and the Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Nikki Fried, who's a Democrat, and she's the head of the Florida Democratic Party now. She won the election for that office in 2018, but then she ran an unsuccessful bid for governor in 2022 and it became Republican again. It's Wilton Simpson, who is actually state my state senator, in terms as in I live in his state senate district. So that's been a pretty red state in the state government for a while, but for a long time it was Democrat across the board. It was very blue. And Massachusetts also used to be a very solidly Republican state. Uh, really a noticeable trend that started in the 1950s, especially for federal seats, as Democrats won elections increasingly often. Now they all of the U.S. House seats there are Democratic right now, and U.S. Senate Republican hasn't won in at least 20 years. I can't remember the last time exactly, but it's now a very blue, very Democratic state. But for way back when, back in yesteryear, they were a very Republican state. So other long-term red and blue streaks, I am actually in the midst of a series of Medium posts about this, about the longest Republican and Democratic streaks, or in another perspective, longest routes for various types of offices. So just some examples for president, governor, and U.S. Senate. So for president, Democrats have not won the following states since 1964. There's 9 of them. It's Alaska, Idaho, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. Both Dakotas are very Republican, and Wyoming may be the most Republican state in the country. Is arguably the case. For the last Republican victory in states, Minnesota is the longest time since a Republican has won it. 1972 for Minnesota, and then there's 6 states that have not been won by Republican presidential candidates since 1984. That'd be Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Washington. For the US Senate, we have states that have not been won by a Democrat in the longest time. Kansas, again, 1932 is the last time a Democrat won it for US Senate. Utah and Wyoming, Democrats haven't won for US Senate since 1970. Idaho in 1974, and then Mississippi in 1982. And then for Republican droughts, Republicans haven't won a U.S. Senate seat in Hawaii since 1970, New Jersey since 1972, Maryland since 1980, Connecticut in 1982, and then California in 1988. And then for governors, South Dakota, or excuse me, longest Democratic droughts going on. So Democrats have not won the governorship in South Dakota since 1974, Utah since 1980, North Dakota since 1988, Idaho since 1990, and Texas since 1990. And then longest Republican droughts for governor, Washington is the longest drought they've had. Republicans haven't won the Washington governorship since 1980. In Oregon, it's been 1982, Delaware 1988, Colorado 2002, and then New York in 2002. So some pretty long-standing streaks going on for those states. And there's some states that I kind of try to keep it at the top 5, unless there were some states that were tied for the top 5. So some of those states, Republicans haven't won a given office, or Democrats haven't won a given office since for 40, 50 years. Or in the case of Kansas's U.S. Senate seats, Democrats haven't won that in over 90 years now. But some major watershed events in U.S. politics where you've seen changes in states' colors, and sometimes it was temporary, sometimes it's been longer standing or even current going on. And these are just a couple of examples. But when Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1932, in the midst of the Great Depression, Democrats had a lot of success all over the U.S. A lot of states shifted blue, even if temporarily. Other times it was a longer term change. But in most of his elections, it started tapered off towards the end when FDR won his 4th presidential election. Then he would pass soon into that. But early on, he won the vast majority of states. But one of the more recent instances of major watershed events where states changed their color is in 2010 state legislative elections. A lot of state chambers were picked up by Republicans, and Republicans became the majority in a majority of state legislative chambers. They picked up 20 of them in 2010, 7 state senates and 13 state houses. They also started picking them up in 2011 and 2012. But since the 2010 elections, Republicans have held a majority of state legislative chambers since then. And there's been some ebbs and flows where Democrats have made some gains and then they lose some, then they make some gains. But since 2010, Republicans have had a majority of state legislative chambers, and they've enjoyed a pretty comfortable lead in that regard since then. And some of these states were once dominated by Democrats historically, but they've been slowly shifting red over time. Alabama being one example. Both chambers flipped to Republican in 2010, and as the state became redder and redder. But even when states didn't flip in 2010, some of them flipped in 2012 or 2011, because there's a few states that have state legislative elections or other elections in odd numbered years, Mississippi being one of them where the one or both chambers of the state legislature, I can't remember for certain, became Republican. And speaking of which, you see there are more states that are becoming deeper shades of red and blue over time. You particularly see a trend of more state government trifectas, which is where the same party for both chambers of a state legislature or the same party wins a majority of both state legislative chambers as well as the governorship. And as Ballotpedia notes, as of August 2024, there's 23 Republican trifectas, 17 Democratic trifectas, and then 10 divided governments in that context. And when we look at it from population standpoint, as of January 2024, 41.7% of the country's population lived in a state with a Democratic trifecta, 41% lived in a state with a Republican trifecta, and 17.4% lived in a state with divided government. A little bit of rounding errors that you got to account for. But it does. Now, obviously, I'm not going to ever argue that that this party should win this election and these candidates should win this election. That's not what I do. That's for you to decide. But I do have a strong belief in the need for political competitiveness because less competition generally means a less responsive government. If they don't have to worry about losing their jobs, they're probably not going to be as responsive. And everybody's constituent. Your constituents are not just one party, they're all across the political spectrum. And then less competition is shown, also less voter participation as well. So there are a lot of issues we have for political competitiveness that need to be addressed. But in any case, that covers red and blue and purple states. Hopefully, this sheds some light on exactly how these are demarcated, how we exactly say a state is red or blue or purple. A lot of times it's not very in-depth or very descriptive, and usually it's just in the context of president. It's not totally objective, but there's some states or a lot of states you can say, okay, that's a red state. Okay, that's a blue state. And so with that, we're going to do our random question of the day, which doesn't necessarily have to do with politics. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. Sometimes there's a correct answer, sometimes there's not. Sometimes it looks like an opinion, but like, come on now. We know what the answer is. This one's not one of those though. So, random question of the day is what's the coolest planet in our solar system? And you can't say Earth. Now that's just it's cheating. So, and if you want, I'll allow Pluto to be used, even though it's technically not a planet anymore. Now, when I was a little kid, I was a big astronomy nerd. I still enjoy astronomy, but obviously I can't devote a whole bunch of time to learning about it. But astronomy is still is my first love. I still love astronomy. So for me, it's Venus because it's a planet we have so little uh, documentation of the surface of because whenever you send probes down there, the pressure of the atmosphere just crushes everything. We do have a few pictures of it. Yeah, funny enough, we used to when science fiction novels back in like the 60s and 70s, before we actually got a look at what the surface of Venus looked like. People imagined lush jungles and basically almost like a paradise. And boy, Venus is not like that at all. Also, it rotates the opposite direction on its axis compared to all the other planets. And its day is longer than its year because a day is how long a planet takes to rotate on its axis, and a year is how long it takes to revolve around the sun. And it takes longer to rotate on the axis than to revolve around the sun, hence a longer day than year. So I think it's the most fascinating planet. But with that being said, let me know what you think, what your answer is in the comments on this video or on social media when I post this. And thank you so much for listening. Again, you can follow me on Facebook, Paul Rader, author and speaker. You can also follow me on LinkedIn and my website, paulrader.org. That being said, I will talk to you later. And until then, take care.